Tracing is an extremely practical and easy to understand concept that can add a lot of variety and style to your personal practice as a dancer. However, sometimes it's difficult to know where to start with an idea like this, and it's very easy to fall into monotonous repetition. So today we're going to lay out 3 drills and also just go over some practical concepts that will help us to incorporate this idea into our everyday exploration. Let's just go ahead and get into it. When it comes to tracing, one of the most valuable concepts that we can latch onto is this idea of our body working as a tool or a medium for movement exploration. In contrast to approaching this concept as something that we are going to make our body do, I think it would be more helpful to think of approaching this idea with the thought of using your body to generate movement ideas. Think about the difference between what it looks like to utilize a math principle and what it looks like to use a hammer. Both are tools. One is more conceptual and one is more practical or physical. And while there is still a conceptual element to exploring this idea of tracing, there's also an immense practicality to utilizing your most valuable and consistent instrument, your own body, as a tool to generate and explore new movement pathways. Now, we refer to this concept as tracing because we are in many ways emulating the practice of utilizing tracing paper to recreate an image from a book or a magazine or a painting. You could also think of utilizing a stencil while drawing versus simply starting with a blank page. We base our production, or rather our exploration, off of the established shape or object that already exists. And when it comes to tracing as a dance concept, that object is our body. If we keep this concept of utilizing tracing paper in mind, we can also begin to explore how we can utilize different body parts in the same way that we would utilize a pen or a pencil while tracing. And so as we continue to explore this idea, I want us to think about this concept of our body as acting as the shape that we're tracing, and then also think about whatever part of our body that we're actually utilizing to do the tracing as a pen or a pencil that's creating the lines and actually following the shape of the object that we're tracing. So now that we've established kind of the key principle and idea behind this concept, we're going to start now to experiment with some drills and patterns that will help us to incorporate this idea into our everyday practice. Now, there's so much that we could dive into when it comes to this topic. We're definitely not going to cover everything in this video. I want you guys to view this video more so as a starting point or a foundation when it comes to your exploration of tracing as a concept. So our first drill is just going to be experimenting with this idea of tracing patterns. I think that this idea has been super helpful for me because sometimes it can just be easy when you start to explore the idea of tracing to not really know where to go, and also to just kind of feel like you have to cover every square inch of your body right away. So for now, we're just going to start to explore a couple of patterns that we can utilize as a fallback when we may not know exactly where we want to go with this concept. I think that these patterns will help us to just slow down a little bit and really narrow our focus and really just help us to be intentional as we explore this concept. So for this first pattern, we're going to think about our starting point as being our hand, and then our ending point as being our knee. Now, when you're tracing, you can obviously create as many stopping points as you want, but for now, we're just going to think about creating this long, drawn-out pathway from our hand down to our knee. So that could look something like this. Maybe you take your right hand out in front of you, and then you utilize your left hand as the instrument or the pencil that you're going to trace your body with. You start at the hand, and maybe you take it down your arm, all the way over to your chest, down your ribs, into your thigh, and down to your knee. Then from here, you can take it all the way back up. You turn it out, pull it up, take it across, and down to your hand again. Super easy, super simple pathway. When I do this, a couple things that I like to think about is, one, starting all the way at my fingertips, rolling all the way down to my shoulder, then from here, moving across to my other shoulder before I continue down to my knee and stop here. I would recommend doing it this way. You could just cut across your front, but I feel like this makes it look a little bit more intentional and just a little bit more shapely. You're following the natural structure of your body and almost viewing it like a roadmap as opposed to just like cutting across a big open space, if that makes sense. Not saying that that's necessarily wrong, but that's just the way that I think about it. So the pathway starts with our hand and then ends down at our knee. Now we could do this with the other side. We could hold our left hand out and then take our right hand, take it all the way up to our shoulder, across, down into our knee. Then reverse it, back up, across, to our hand. This is a super easy and super simple pathway, but it really hits a lot of major points on the body. And honestly, this is probably one of the most classic pathways that you can take with your tracing. And there's lots of different ways that you can explore this idea. You don't necessarily have to start with your arm straight out to the side. Once you get more comfortable with this basic pathway, you can start to explore what it's like to take that same pathway, but just change a little bit the shape of your arm, maybe the direction that you're taking to get there. I like to experiment with this idea of changing the shape of my arm. You could also experiment with what it's like to switch legs and maybe lift your leg off of the ground. You don't always have to go to the opposite leg. You could start here and just go down to the same leg as the arm that's extended. This is a super fun and classic pathway. It's pretty easy to understand, but if you can learn how to master and utilize it, it really is a valuable tool. And really, it's one of the main pathways that we utilize when we play around with the concept of tracing. The next pathway that we're going to explore is this behind the head pathway. So we're going to think about utilizing both of our shoulders for this one. Now you can do this with either arm. I'm going to start with y'all's right arm. I'm going to think about taking my right arm to my right shoulder. And then from here, I'm going to think about tracing behind my back across my shoulder. And then once I get here, I'm going to think about almost threading my head through my arm as I trace down my opposite arm. So a little bit faster, that'll look something like this. I start with my right shoulder, I take it back and around, I start to lift my opposite arm, thread my head through, finish at my hand. This is a super cool pathway. I play around with this one quite often. You can also start this pathway with your hand. Almost just think about reversing what we just did. Starting with the hand, pulling through, threading up and around your head, bringing it through to your shoulder. So you can either start with your shoulder and thread around the back, or start with your hand and thread around the front. You can also think about what it would look like to combine the other pathway that we just talked about. And the last pathway that we're going to talk about today is this shoulder to foot pathway. Now this one is kind of similar to the one where we started with our hand and went down to our knee. We're just going to expand the range a little bit. So we're going to think about starting with our right hand, taking it to our left shoulder. From here, we could go one of two ways. We could either go straight down our rib cage to our hip, or we could cross from our shoulder to our opposite shoulder to then move down to our rib cage on the other side. You can choose whichever direction you would like, whatever feels most comfortable for you. I'm probably going to start here, go across my shoulder, and then take it down. So we start here with my left shoulder, we're going to pull it across to our right shoulder, then we're going to take it down to our right hip, and then continue all the way down to our foot. Then we're going to reverse it, take it all the way up the leg, up into the shoulder, cross it back over to our left shoulder. Now there's a couple different variations for this idea. You could either think about following the pathway that we just laid out. You could think about following the pathway where you go straight down and then cross over. You could follow the pathway instead of crossing over to go down to the opposite leg as the shoulder that you started with, just going down the same leg as the shoulder that you started with. Start with my left shoulder, go down my left side, all the way down to my left foot. Hold up real quick, I gotta cover the window. Boom. So those are just a couple of super easy, fun pathways that you can explore on your own. Now the truth is that when it comes to these movement pathways, there really aren't a ton of rules. You can create your own pathways by simply choosing a starting point on your body and an ending point. So let's say you want your starting point to be your right elbow and then your ending point to be your left hip. You can start here with your elbow, take it around your head and down to your hip. Or you can make a super short pathway. It could be from your hip to your knee. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. The length of the pathway or the start and end position of the pathway are not necessarily what's important. It's more this idea of learning to establish different start and end points in your body so that you have a pathway that you can explore. So feel free to experiment with those pathways. You can also feel free to change them or manipulate them however works best for you. Those are just some pretty classic ideas that I personally utilize quite frequently whenever I play around with this concept of tracing, so I wanted to share them with you. Now, a little side note before we move on to our next drill. As you're continuing to explore these pathways, there's a lot of simple ideas that we can play around with to add a little bit of variation and style as we explore this concept. One of those is thinking about our timing and the different variations that we can explore within that. Let's say that you're playing around with this hand to knee tracing pathway. You could think about establishing an amount of time that it takes to travel between each point. So maybe you start at your hand, and you're going to take an entire 8 count to travel all the way down to your knee. So that could look like this: 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then you could reverse it: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Do that on the other side, and then maybe you could even find a progression and make it a little bit faster the next time. Instead of doing a full 8 count, you just do 4 counts: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or 2 counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or maybe you take it really slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That might be a little bit painful, but really the idea is to just think about how you can utilize and manipulate your timing to add a little bit of variation so that it doesn't always just become one tempo as you're tracing, you know? That could get a little bit monotonous. It doesn't always just have to be slow trace behind the head, slow trace around the head. Playing around with your rhythm and exploring different tempos is a super fun way to add variety to your tracing. Another thing that we can think about is the texture that we're creating with our hands as we're tracing. We don't always just have to hold one continuous shape with our hand as we're tracing. We could think about what it looks like to add a little crawl or a little shape. We could think about adding tick marks so that it's not just one continuous line. Break it up a little bit. Maybe we play around with our timing and the textures at the same time. These are just some things that will help you to dive a little bit deeper into how you're doing what you're doing. And this goes for any concept. Instead of just thinking about doing the idea, think about how you're doing the idea. Think about how you are exploring and making this concept your own. Make it work for you, make it unique to you and your own style. You don't have to play around with any of these ideas, but if one of them resonates with you, why not? Take it, add it to your toolkit. Think about how you can first utilize and understand the concept itself, and then from there, how you can start to incorporate the concept into your own style and bring out your own individuality as you explore it. So that was our first drill. And now this second drill is going to involve this idea of imagining and exploring different established shapes on our bodies. Let me show you what I mean. I have a couple of different shapes for us today. There's obviously unlimited options here, but these are just a couple that I'm going to give to you guys now to get you started, and these are just some thoughts that I typically play around with whenever I'm exploring this idea of tracing. We're gonna try to establish 3 shapes on our bodies that you can utilize as pathways as you're exploring this concept of tracing. The first of those 3 shapes is going to be this rectangle shape in our center. So we're gonna think about finding 4 points here. One of the points is our right shoulder, the other point is our left shoulder, the third point is our right hip, and the fourth point is our left hip. Now if you can keep those 4 points in your head, you can start to see this little rectangle that we're imagining. This idea is nice for me because when it comes to like surface area on our body, I'd say that our front is probably the most accessible and the most extensive surface area that we have. And so sometimes I feel like it's very easy to maybe get lost or feel like there's a lack of direction when it comes to our center, especially when it comes to tracing. And so having these different established points really helps to give me a little bit of structure whenever I think about exploring or moving around my center when I'm tracing. Now, once we have these points established, we can think about creating pathways and traveling in between each point. You could start at your right shoulder, move to your left shoulder, down to your left hip, and across to your right hip, and then back up. Or you could cross over your body. You could cross from your right shoulder to your left hip. Take it up, bring it over, bring it back, whatever pathway you want to establish. I think that these are key concepts when it comes to exploring pathways when you're tracing. Having a very clear start and end point is going to be key because it's not only going to help you conceptually understand better what you're doing, but it's also going to help the people that are watching you conceptually understand what you're doing. Think about being very clear with it and being intentional as opposed to just sort of like haphazardly kind of moving across your body. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do it, but whatever it is that you are doing, be intentional about it, and that will help the idea that you're playing around with to come across as clear as you want it to. The second shape that we're gonna talk about is this oval shape around our thighs. Now, I like to think about this one as starting at the top of my hip, traveling down either the inside or the outside of my leg, all the way around to the very bottom of my knee, and then back up the opposite side that I started. I like this one a lot because when we're tracing, it's very common to have our end point be our knee. It's just a very obvious point to travel to, and sometimes you don't want to just stop at your knee and then start back up. Let's say you're playing around with this hand to knee tracing pathway. You could start at your hand, take it all the way down, and instead of simply stopping to move back up, you could continue around the knee to find a new pathway. Super simple idea, but this is one that I utilize pretty commonly. You could think about almost finding a little bit of manipulation as you explore this idea, or just simply holding it in one position. This one's super helpful, and it's actually sort of a precursor for our next shape that we're gonna talk about. And this next shape is a circle shape that we find on our elbows and our knees. It's almost the same idea as this oval idea, and it almost has the same function. Now these shapes are super helpful and fun for a couple of reasons. So let's use our forearm as an example. I could start at my hand and then start traveling up, and once I get to my elbow, thinking about a circle shape either existing around my elbow or around my arm, I can travel the pathway of that circle to then return to where I came. So I start here, I come all the way down, I meet that circle point, I take it around, and I go back down. Now you don't have to think about a circle specifically to play around with this concept, but for some of us I think that it might be helpful as we're beginning to explore this concept of tracing to think about having a literal shape that we can follow as we're exploring different pathways. The same concept could apply with your legs. Let's say we start with our left shoulder, we could take it down, across, into our knee. Now we could either stop and simply return back to that point, or we could travel down and around the knee and never stop moving. Now from here, we could either simply stop and then return to go back, or we could think about finding a more continuous pathway. Now just like the last one, there really is no limits to this idea, and you can explore whatever shapes that are most helpful for you. These are just some super classic shapes that I personally utilize a lot within my own practice and that have been super helpful for me. So that was our second drill, and now our third and final drill that we're gonna talk about is this concept of manipulating while we're tracing. Now there's a couple of different ways that we could play around with this idea. We could think about one part of our body as being manipulated by another part as we're following different pathways. Let's say I'm following a pathway from my shoulder down to my hip, or I could utilize my other hand and direct my hand to that point. Well, let's say I'm going shoulder to shoulder. I could go from here to here, or I could start here and move it across. Another way that we could think about playing with this idea is almost this concept of utilizing the force or attracting your hand. So instead of thinking about physically moving your hand, you could simply think about attracting it or repelling it. You could think about hovering over your hand, almost like you're controlling where the tracing is happening. You could think about your hand as being attached to a string. You can find different textures, or even start to think about what it looks like to trace with other body parts. There's so many different ways that we can play around with this concept, and I personally have found it to be super fun and super helpful. And I think one of the coolest things about utilizing and exploring this concept of tracing is that it forces you to approach your movement in a little bit different of a way than you would exploring any other concept. Tracing is a little bit different from other concepts because a lot of concepts exist outside of our body. If we're talking about something like the compass concept, that exists on the floor, disconnected from our body, and we're simply utilizing that imagery to create more variation and to establish more pathways for ourselves as we're dancing. But when it comes to tracing, in many ways, our bodies are the medium for exploration within the concept. We can't trace something that isn't our body. I mean, we could. I guess we could trace a shape on the floor, but the main idea and the main way that we play around with tracing is by exploring the different shapes and angles of our body. And I think it's super cool because you always have your body and it's always available to you. And so as you explore this idea on your own, I think it might be helpful to think about this concept in that way. This isn't something that exists outside of us. This concept is more about what it looks like to know and to understand our own bodies and how we can utilize them to generate new ideas within our movement. Now that's pretty much gonna do it for our breakdown of these concepts today. If you guys would like a part 2 of this video, or just for me to dive deeper into any of these concepts, be sure to leave that down below in the comments. Check out The Shed on Instagram, and be sure to go check out The Shed on Patreon as well. There's still not a lot going on over there, but the Fundamentals of Hip Hop course is on its way. It's very close to being done. I've had a little bit of a hiccup because I'm dealing with a bit of a knee injury, so I haven't been able to work on it as much as I would have liked, but we're very close to being done, and I'm super excited for you guys to see it and to get your feedback on it. And so it would just mean a lot if you would take a little bit of time to go check the Patreon, join as a free member. Soon there will be a lot more exclusive perks and things that you guys can do when you're over there. I want to thank you guys so much for your time and watching this video, and I'm gonna see you guys in the next one. Peace out.